Gospel reading today is probably a familiar story. It's the feeding of the 5,000, and we're going to be reading from Matthew 14, verses 13 to 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. It says in our gospel reading that when Jesus heard this, Jesus had actually heard that John the Baptist had been killed by Herod. Jesus needed time to grieve and to pray. The area that Jesus was staying in was densely populated, and it was even more crowded than normal because it was near the time of Passover. Jesus wanted to get away from the noise and to spend time with God. This is one lesson that we can take from this gospel reading. We should look to find time and space to be alone with God and to pray and to be refreshed. As Jesus and his disciples headed across the lake in a boat, the people saw him, and guessing where he was going, they made their way there. And instead of finding a quiet place to relax, Jesus arrived to find a crowd of people waiting for him. Instead of being annoyed or angry, Jesus, despite his own grief and pain, recognized the needs of others. He spent that day teaching and healing them. I wonder whether we can learn from Jesus about being attentive to the needs of others. As it came to evening, Jesus' closest disciples could see that there was a problem. They approached Jesus and they suggested that he send the people away so that they could go and buy themselves food. In other words, let the crowds fend for themselves. Instead of agreeing to this, Jesus said that there was no need to send the people away, and he suggests that the disciples feed the people instead. I wonder how the disciples felt. Shocked, frustrated, overwhelmed? Is this how we feel when we are confronted by the needs of the world? Where do we start when the task seems overwhelming? In the other Gospels, we're told that Jesus' disciples worked out how much money it would cost to feed the people, and they concluded that to feed them would be an impossible task. Jesus showed them a different solution. He looked for what resources were already available, those things that were already to hand. And there were 5 loaves and there were 2 fish. And Jesus takes these and he prays over them and he blesses them. Jesus didn't simply just wade in and solve the problem by providing food from elsewhere. He started with what was already available, and then he prayed over it. In the other Gospels, we're told that the food that Jesus blessed was offered by a young boy. This demonstrates that the young and the poor can be involved in solving the problems that we may face. Everybody has a value to God and is useful in carrying out God's plans. In the other Gospels, we're told how Jesus encouraged the disciples to sit the crowds into groups on the grass. and then they helped to distribute the food amongst themselves. This demonstrates that the people weren't simply served their food, but they were put into groups or communities, and they were each involved in helping to distribute the food. Community was fully involved in helping to solve the problem of feeding each other. There are many lessons that we can learn from this reading, and here are just a few of them. The importance of finding space and seeking quiet time to meet with God, being aware of the needs of others, and when we do, to feel their pain and to with God and others to alleviate it, to be willing to offer the resources that we have to be used by God, to see that prayer and thanksgiving changes situations, to recognise that all people, even the most vulnerable, should be involved in bringing about change that's needed, and that we are called to do these things not alone, but rather with God and with the community to bring about positive change through prayer and thanksgiving. Amen.